Let me start here by, indicating from where we depart. Well, basically, we depart from a kind of, understanding of what is out there in terms of, the working conditions of care workers working and providing services through these digital platforms. Now, I must say that there is not much work unfortunately, on the care platforms per se. There is a lot of work on the gig economy, food and delivery riders, careers is, monopolizing everything, freelancing to a certain extent, but there is really not much on care digital platforms. And we think that perhaps our study could contribute also in understanding a little bit better. What exists there actually points to an important kind of opposition, the kind of understanding of what these platforms do in dealing with care services. Why do I say this? Well, let me start from the work done by Clarissa Weber, who is actually digging into, the global South. And she argues out of her study that platforms in developing countries, they normally facilitate this kind of transitions of work or labor from informality into formality. The way how she explained this is simply because she says platforms in these developing countries, which are very much dominated by informal labor, they need to require formal services provisions, and therefore this automatically leads for workers who want to provide services through these platforms to navigate or kind of having this transit from informality into formality. But this is basically also, let's say, contrasted by studies who have been done in the United States, and particularly here, fascinating study done by Giulia Ticona and Matescu that basically argue in the opposite direction. So it seems that these care platforms are not really incentivizing kind of formality, but they are actually creating and letting informality in this sector growing much more. And when they talk about informality, they define informality as also the work done by Sedaka. So work might be informal as workers conducted outside the sphere of formal paid employment, no reporting their own income and pay taxes, and therefore work is also excluded from social rights and protection. What is also very much interesting, and it is what we try to do in our paper, we cannot deal with care without dealing with, the kind of feminized labor market in which care sector is embedded. And therefore, in fact, this idea of informality is very much intersecting with the female nature of the workers performing this work, and also the kind of racialized and ethnic hierarchies which also prevail in these kind of sectors. And we will show in our data some interesting results on that side. So when we were, studying, we kind of were thinking about how to theoretically frame here our contribution. We thought that the best way perhaps to do it, since we were collecting data in Europe in a kind of cross-national perspective, was to try to see what was happening in Europe. If we look at these care platforms and workers, do we see moving from formality to informality or informality towards formality? And this is quite interesting in the European area, where we do know that, we have a lot of countries where care is actually regulated, in some countries more than others. So it was quite interesting and challenging. And therefore, the question we posed is whether and how do digital mediated domestic and care services provision endure the invisibility and informality of care work in mature market economies in Europe? And what we found out in a nutshell is that basically here we have a completely opposite scenario. There's a lot of moving from formality into informality. And we show this kind of raising of informality reflected through the care workers experiences that have been, collected through narrative interviews in our study. And we do it by looking at one specific concept or one specific element here, which is the individualization of risk. And we use the kind of idea of McDonald, which is quite interesting. And we operationalize this individualization of risk through what we mentioned being unpaid labor. So, sorry, I forgot to put that. Okay, so what about these, very, very briefly about this idea of the individualization of risk in care work put forward by McDonald. So McDonald basically employs this idea of individualized risk to describe different types of risks which are common in care workers' account of their own experiences. And basically, she looks at different dimensions of risk of isolating and individualizing the worker, risk of fragmenting work, working time, and work life, and the risk of gendered under-evaluation. But also she looks at the different structures in which these kind of risks are embedded and which are basically across different levels. There is a more micro level, which is also the level we look at, which is the workers' experience of risk, but also the meso level, the consumer choices and labor control, and the macro, which is also something we bring in our study, which is the market-driven prices, market operation and practices, and also the institutional, socioeconomic, and technological transformations. Now, the way, as I said before, the way in which we operationalize the kind of risk we see in this care platform, and particularly taken by care workers, is the unpaid labor. Unpaid labor for us, the way how we understand this, is a cost. It's a cost that workers doing this, providing these services through care platform, they bear individually at the intersection of what we see here being economic and social. And Claudia will dig much more into the findings on that. But the question here is to say, listen, unpaid labor is in fact an economic cost in terms of, monetary, financial cost, is time that people spend doing tasks which are part of a job description, but which basically are not remunerated anymore because are given for granted. But also, equipment and travel time also that people spend, but also is a social cost. And we have a lot of these social costs coming in, which is part of these care activities being in the interpersonal, personal and relational. And here we contribute, I think, also in kind of thinking through the idea of emotional labor of Orschel vis-a-vis care, and we see how this translates into care, into the context of care platform. The informality of labor, we use here the definition of the ILO. What is informal labor? Is workers with casual work arrangements, no fixed salary, no documented service interaction by paying taxes and or reporting income, and therefore also not having social rights and social protection. Now, again, the way in which these individualized risk in care work comes through is through this unpaid labor, as I said before, and particularly here is something which is done through the we use the concept of Juliette Haidar and Martin Kuhne of this market dominance. In other words, unpaid labor comes from the strategies of these platforms. So if you like the more meso level here, but also mediated through labor markets. And why do we see here this happening? Well, we have done our study by comparing two different platforms, care platforms, across two countries, Belgium and France. And we have been keeping this platform constant across France and Belgium. Now, the selection of France and Belgium, and Claudia again will go much more into that, but very, simply said, is very interesting in the sense that Belgium and France are two mature market economy in Europe. They are regulated in terms of care settings, but they are regulated in different ways. So we see a kind of divergence there in the extent of regulation, which is very interesting and also helps us explaining how this kind of platform really kind of shift the risk, economic and social, on the workers. And the mechanism that we identify in our study, particularly in Belgium and France, which are mediated through labor market institutions, are the ones that you can see here on the slide. We talk about entrance by disruption and entrance by regulatory avoidance. What does it mean? Very simply is that we see the shifting of the risk done by care platform through their own strategies of market dominance, taking this kind of image of entrance by disruption in Belgium, which is quite country regulated in terms of care provisions, and platform enter and they have to really disrupt this kind of system. They really kind of hit to the system. Whereas in France is a kind of more liberal, if you like, image and liberal setting, where we see in fact that what happens here is an entrance by regulatory avoidance. In other words, platform comply with regulation by avoiding, if you like. And this is quite interesting also in terms of what it was said before in terms of what is the role of the state in this kind of scenarios, where we see, in fact, the state really not taking interesting position in regulating the kind of area of self-regulation that platforms really announce. And I give it over to Claudia. Claudia, please.
Very briefly on the research design and the methodology that we used, which Valeria already mentioned. So we are comparing Belgium and France, which have both clearly a mature market context, but they differ in terms of the regulations that have put in place over the past 20 years. We collected data in both countries amounting to 27 narrative interviews with care platform workers, and we also combine it with desk research, especially on national regulations and the functioning of platforms, to understand how the platforms worked for both clients and workers. Briefly touching on the regulatory context, because as Valeria explained, it's of course important to understand the way platforms perform market dominance within these regulated contexts. Belgium and France share a quite common trajectory in time, in a way, because they both implemented at the beginning of the 2000s, around 2004, 2005, policies aimed at formalizing the domestic care sector, but in pretty different ways. Although they both use so-called voucher systems, the voucher system function in very different ways, both in the service provision, because this is a bit also the distinctiveness of these policies, because they both regulate the service market and at the same time the employment relations. So while in France, the CESU, Système Chèque Emploi Service Universel, which applies to all sorts of care assistance and domestic work, hinges on the idea of private employment, where the worker has to find multiple employers in many cases, and there is a présomption de salariat, so a presumption of employment, once the employment is subscribed by the private employer and the worker. In Belgium, the system is regulated in a very different way. First of all, because the voucher system only applies to domestic work, so cooking, ironing, and so on and so forth, but not to personal assistance. And personal assistance is just provided as in a very traditional way through in-kind services by organizations that employ the workers. And at the same time, also domestic work through the voucher system is regulated in a tripartite system where the workers are employees under standard employment agreements through agencies. So the difference is pretty substantial when it comes to the effort that the workers have to make in finding the work and accessing then jobs. In terms of the platforms, the two platforms, as Valeria mentioned, we kept the two platforms constant in the two countries, and the platforms are also very similar, because we want, of course, to see how they reacted. Oh, okay. How they reacted, sorry, I'll have to be very fast there. So just on the platforms, UPs and Top Help, workers can make profiles, can look for jobs directly through applications, and also clients can send requests for jobs or poke workers directly. And of course, there is a review system, which is pretty important also, like in other platforms, where only the client can review the worker and not vice versa. In terms of the findings, and I'll unfortunately have to be super fast on this. So we see how the individualization risk of conducting unpaid occurs at different also moments in the access to work, and then, as we'll see, in the performing of work. We first focus on the economic costs that are shifted on the workers. In the access to work, this is very significant when it comes to the Belgian workers, because Belgian workers would otherwise not have to look for jobs themselves. And this it really shifts a lot of significant costs on the workers in making a very good profile, in making applications, in doing interviews. And at the same time, we actually see that an increase of this cost occurs in France as well, because workers, although they have to sort of like do the same amount of, of activities also in the normal labor market, the platform increases this cost because, for example, they have to create the profile and nurture the profile and so on and so forth. In the performance of work, we see that the increase, the shifting of course, and of costs and the individualization of course of costs, occurs in particular because the platform deformalized the work. And this occurs, as Valeria mentioned before, because of the market strategies that they have. Like in particular, in Belgium, they disrupt the regulation because there is no possibility of hiring the workers directly, which is what the way the platforms mediates the relationship between the employer and the worker. And in France, it's just because the platforms do not enforce the regulation that could be potentially done through the platforms, because the CESU system is very flexible and makes it very easy actually to regulate ex post after the work contract is, after the job is found in a way. And this shifts substantial cost to workers because the pay is usually below the statutory minima. There is no access, of course, to social protection. There is an intensification of costs of work, as you can see from the second put, which I clearly don't have the time to read. Yes. And so the costs related to informality are very substantial. And this is our third part of the findings, which, as Valeria mentioned, we also find, so it's not only about economic costs, but it's a lot about the social emotional costs, which are shifted on the worker. And we don't only see the emotional labor found in traditional care work a la Oxfield or a la Daniels, where workers are supposed to be patient and lovingly and carrying out all this emotional labor that needs to be performed in care work, but also, which we find very distinctive of platform work, is the amount of other social costs that are related to the scams that occur on platforms and that require a lot of figuring out work to the workers to understand what sorts of clients they're going to face, what sorts of jobs they're going to face. And this really emerges very vividly from our narrative interviews, where workers are requested to do, requested or asked, and then of course they, in most cases, reject this request of working in a bikini, of giving massage, of, very severe cases of sexual harassment that sometimes they can easily shut down through messages. But when they are there in the place, they sort of, they clearly have not only to figure out, but also to endure this forms of very severe emotional costs. And I'm sorry, yes.
Okay. So just to conclude,
Yes.
all there. Yeah, very quickly. Well, I think with this paper does three things. The first thing is to extend a little bit the kind of understanding or deepening the understanding of what this risk is about, which is for us is this unpaid labor operationalized through these economic on the one hand and social costs, which we extend also, which goes behind the pure emotional care labor, but goes into what we see being this kind of figuring out or more kind of harassment sort of things. The second thing is to understand the way in which all these is intermediated or interfacing through labor market and how operates. And here the comparison between France and Belgium is quite interesting in terms of this avoidance on the one end and more disruption on the other end. And the third one is the role of the state. What is the role of the state here is absent. So there is, what we argue is that the problem paradoxically are not the platforms. It's not digital platform who is the problem. The problem are the government and the lack of enforcement of existing regulation on the way in which platforms operate. Thank you very much.